Episode 112 of the Interpretation Station is called to order. Welcome, ladies and gentlemen. How is everyone doing on this, the 29th of January 2022? We've got a bit of a treat for you in store for you today. We've got a bit of a medley. Haven't done a medley in a while, so I thought the occasion was ripe after a meeting I did this week at work. It was on Monday afternoon, and so far this year it's been pretty quiet at my work, right? Previous week I'd been all day in this meeting, UNECE, Economic Commission for Europe, and you know how it goes sometimes in the English booth. You just sit there and you barely turn the microphone on. There was one day I'd had a bit of Uzbekistan. That was about it. And so then lo and behold, suddenly on Monday afternoon I get put in to the Universal Periodic Review of Syria, suddenly going from absolutely nothing to going the UPR on Syria, and I sort of cacked my pants when I found out. Syria, UPR. But anyway, I thought it was a good opportunity to take stock, shall we say, of the situation in Syria. You might be familiar with how the UPR works. The country, they send a big delegation, usually very important, high-ranking delegation, and they present to the public what they have done in terms of complying with all the UN human rights treaties. And the Syrians took this very seriously. And they sent, as head of delegation, their permanent representative in New York. And that is a guy, you probably recognize him actually, Bashar al-Jafari. It's a guy, big guy, very impressive looking guy, at least to look at. Funnily enough, me and him have a bit of a history. Back in 2015, I think it was, we went together to, we spent a romantic boat trip on a lake outside Managua in Nicaragua. Yeah, I kid you not. It wasn't, to be honest, it wasn't just me and him, and I never actually spoke to him. But in 2015, there was a big summit of the Trusteeship Council in UN. That's one of the organs there. And they held a big, biennial summit or something. It was in Managua, at Nicaragua. We all stayed at the Holiday Inn, and I remember there was one night when the Nicaraguan authorities took all of us, including me and old Bashar, out on this boat trip around this lake in Managua. So I always remember our time together. But so anyway, he was there, and I thought, this would be a good chance to, as I say, take stock of what's going on in Syria, remind ourselves of some of the critical vocab, and just do a bit of a tour around the languages. So I've got statements for you today from France. Okay, that's one of the biggies, obviously, in French. And then from Spanish, we've got Venezuela and Ecuador, who are sort of on two different sides, really. So the Venezuelans are big supporters of the Syrians. Ecuador are more pro-Western, shall we say, these days. Ecuador always seems to change sides quite regularly. These days, they're pro-West. And then we've got Russia, who's obviously the biggest champion, shall we say, of the Syrian regime, maybe Russia and Iran anyway. And we're going to try some Arabic as well at the end. So we've got Iraq, who is, I guess, one of Syria's neighbours, to see what their take is. So I'm going to experiment a bit there with the Arabic statement. So anyway, watch all this. Try and watch all the statements, because there's interesting, unique vocabulary that's raised in all five of them. We're going to go through them fairly fast, so I think I'm going to call this a wham bam thank you Roland episode. And we're going to start with France. So I'm going to share the screen with you. Okay, so hopefully you can see that. So as I said, this was on Monday, 24th of January. This was by the permanent representative of France. So all these delegations, when they come after the main delegation has made their presentation, their intro, then they do they go around all the other delegations, and obviously everyone wanted to speak for Syria, so they have to manage the time accordingly. You can see here each delegation got 1 minute and 10 seconds only to speak about the situation there, so they pack everything in that they want to say into a very short period of time. It can be very hard to do. If you guys, you're new to it, you get dropped into it, takes some getting used to. You do tend to get most of the statements, fortunately. So you do have time to prepare, but it can be pretty stressful nevertheless. So anyway, let's see what the French had to say. And so I've just made a few notes here. I'll stop here and there and talk about some of the vocab that's being used. Thank you, Mr. President. That's a president, okay. So currently the new president of the Human Rights Council is actually a Spanish speaker. It is Ambassador Federico Villegas, and he is the permanent representative of Argentina. So, Argentina is presiding this year in the Human Rights Council. So anyway, let's see what the French said. Okay, so here we go. So, Mr. President, the situation in Syria has, for more than a decade, been marked by... Now, unfortunately, we had the text, the text came... We had a chance to prepare it, so we see all the adjectives at the end here. Systematic, mass, and ongoing violations of human rights and of international humanitarian law, so IHL. So just like here, constant, so ongoing is a good word to have for that. It also occurred to me here for marqué par des violations. So I guess the neutral thing to say here would be just marked by, cognate. But I think you could also possibly say marred by, would also very close, when it's obviously has that negative connotation, has been marred by systematic mass, ongoing violations of human rights and of international humanitarian law. These unacceptable violations doivent cesser, must stop. And the perpetrators, for les auteurs, perpetrators is always the best word for that, must be held to account. Rendre des comptes, very important expression. That must be held accountable, held to account. Now, here's an interesting expression. Il revient au régime syrien. I mean, you could say it's up to the Syrian regime, but again, if you want to strike a slightly higher register, there's a couple of good words in English. The onus is on the Syrian regime. It is incumbent on the Syrian regime. Those are very high register words which sound nice. Qui est à l'origine de cette situation? Maybe, you could say which was at the origin of this situation or which created this situation. And qui est le premier responsable? So here you have to step back a little bit because in English we don't say really who is the primary responsibility bearer. I think we would rephrase this more as a sort of verbal phrase, which bears primary responsibility. So you can see there I've written it in. Who created this situation, which bears primary responsibility for these violations à l'encontre de, just against its own population, to implement the following recommendations. So this is how they do it in the UPR when a country speaks. Virtually every time they have the intro and then they'll give them the recommendations which the country under review can either accept or reject. So you can bet when it's someone like France, the Syrians will probably reject them. 1. Put an end to deliberate attacks against civilian populations and infrastructure, and ensure, now here's some important adjectives, immediate, complet, comprehensive, sûr, safe, and sans entrave, unhindered or unimpeded humanitarian access. Okay, so that really is typical UN speak when they talk about allowing humanitarian aid to get through to populations in need. Okay, immediate, comprehensive, safe, unhindered access. And you'll see other delegations using this throughout. Sur l'ensemble du territoire syrien. If you're in a hurry, if you didn't have the text, maybe you could just say throughout the country. But we've got the text. We say throughout all of Syria, all Syrian territory. But I would attempt to just say throughout the country there. Release, libérer. I suppose you could say liberate, but I guess we release prisoners, right? This is what this recommendation is going to be about, prisoners. Immediate release immediately and without conditions. Toutes les personnes détenues, all persons detained arbitrarily by the regime. Or you could just say all those detained arbitrarily by the regime. If you're in a hurry, you don't really need the persons. To account for the fate of personnes disparues. So you could say disappeared persons, I think missing persons, though, is perhaps the most sort of versatile. I think everyone knows what there is a difference. There's a slight nuance between missing persons and disappeared persons. Legally speaking, there is a difference. I think missing persons, though, is the term you tend to hear most frequently, at least in the media. And now often they'll also talk about, so here, I mean, I'm going literally, okay, account for the fate du sort. They'll often talk in that context when it comes to missing persons or disappeared persons about establishing the whereabouts. So that's a good sort of synonym to have, a good expression that has a very similar meaning, at least, to what's being said here. Because here it's not just to do with the whereabouts. Here we want to find out what happened to them. So maybe you want to get maybe that idea here, account for the fate. But I think if you said it to establish the whereabouts, it wouldn't be. It would be a good alternative. Put an end to arbitrary executions, torture, and all pratique inhumaine en vigueur. I mean, in this case, it's en vigueur. Usually it means, in effect, in force, when they're talking about laws. Here it's really ongoing inhumane practices in all lieux de détention, places of detention facilities, one or the other. 3, create conditions, again, so here's some more of this package of a class sort of textbook package of adjectives when talking about refugees and IDPs. So safe, dignified and voluntary return of refugees and IDPs. Again, this is something of a sort of stock package of adjectives when it comes to this kind of concept. Safe, dignified and voluntary. They all really go together, okay, those adjectives when talking about returns. So déplacés, you can say IDPs. And put an end to all violations they've been victim of once back in Syria. Une fois revenu en Syrie, once returned to Syria. 4, authorize the, commission d'enquête is the commission of inquiry, or that is sometimes known as the COI. So this sort of mechanism, commissions of inquiry, are something the UN uses quite a bit. So yeah, just remember that it's a commission, not a commission of investigation. It's specifically a commission of inquiry. And le mécanisme international impartial et indépendant. So this is it's all fairly straightforward. It's all cognates, the international, impartial, and independent mechanism. So they tend to call it the triple I mechanism. So I've heard them say the triple I mechanism or the triple IM as well. So gives you the acronym that includes the mechanism within the acronym. So you want to again be familiar with that. Authorize the COI and the triple IM to travel to Syrian territory. I thank you. Okay, so that was the French for you. So now let's move on and do a bit of Spanish. Okay, so let's see if there's any overlap in terms of expression. So again, remember, the Ecuador will probably be more or less singing from the same hymn sheet as France. You'd be guessing. It's always important, by the way, to do that. If you're in a meeting, and that can help you to know what angle they're going to be coming in from. So you want to have a vague idea of where countries stand, which sort of what alliances they form. So these days Ecuador tends to be sort of more pro-Western, so they're probably going to be talking about similar things to the French. So again, President, Ecuador thanks the Syrian delegation for presenting its report. Sometimes we'll say for presentación de su informe, I'll sometimes say for introducing its report, just not to always be saying presenting, because in these UPRs, I say you'll have a speakers list of like over 100 countries, all speaking for 1 minute, 10 seconds. And it can just, for yourself, get boring just to keep saying the same thing. Just Ecuador is grateful for the delegation of presenting, so maybe introducing, submitting, okay, and expresses its concern at the el conflicto prolongado. That's an important adjective to be comfortable with, especially when they talk about conflict. Okay, they do like to talk about protracted conflicts. Okay, not prolonged conflicts, but protracted conflict in this country, especially at the grave violations of human rights and, again, of international humanitarian law. So as you see, these countries, there's a lot of repetition going on. Anyway, it's a good way, it does sort of help really embed those terms in your head when you're doing it over and over again, right? It's all about repetition. It's all about repetition, right? My son today, he's 9 years old, still sort of struggling with tying his shoelaces. So I told him, I went out there, I had to go and run a couple of errands. So I told him, okay, right, you're not doing anything Saturday morning. So I got him his shoes, said, I want you to tie this shoelace 50 times while I'm away. 50 times. Just tie it, untie it, keep going. So he did it. He says he did. I came back, he says, yeah, Dad, I did do it 50 times. He seemed to be doing a bit better. So anyway, it's good because, when these meetings, you hear these same expressions coming up. And they, again, as I say, they do eventually take root in your brain. So international humanitarian law, or IHL. In a constructive spirit, they say this all the time again. Sometimes they'll say in a spirit of constructive dialogue, okay. In a constructive spirit, Ecuador would formulate, if you like, would make the following recommendations. Okay, 1, put an end to indiscriminate attacks against civilians and civil infrastructure, including schools, hospitals, e instalaciones humanitarias. Again, for instalaciones, the safest word to go for in English, I think, is facilities. Okay, humanitarian facilities. End the practice of enforced disappearance, arbitrary detention, and all forms of torture. Those three things tend to go together, often. Enforced disappearance, not forced, but enforced disappearance, arbitrary detention, and torture. 3, permit or allow safe, unhindered access. There we go again. Okay, what do we have in the French? It was sûr et sans entrave. Okay, so seguro y sin trabas. Okay, safe, unhindered access for humanitarian assistance organizations. 4, adopt the necessary measures to prevent the recruitment and the use of children in hostilities. Okay, this sort of all refers to the idea, preventing the use of children in armed conflict. Okay. 5, guarantee rendición de cuentas. Okay. Accountability. Here we go again. So the Ecuadorians accounting for accountability de los responsables de violaciones a los derechos humanos. Okay. Los responsables, the perpetrators. Okay. Violations of human rights, including acts of sexual violence and, GBV. So I've put here GBV, gender-based violence. This is something, again, that comes up a lot. Often it does come up, though, I think there is a sort of maybe a legal distinction between sexual violence and gender-based violence, but definitely be familiar with that acronym. Ecuador, so then when you come to the end, it's always like Ecuador wishes the delegation of Syria success in the final adoption of its UPR report. Again, that concluding sentence is always more or less going to be the same from every country. Sometimes you want to tweak it here and there. Okay, so that one's quite straightforward. Let's go and have a look now. Some more Spanish, but this time coming from a different angle. This is going to be Venezuela. So the Venezuelans are traditionally much more pro-Syria than countries like Ecuador or France. So if you're not saying stuff that sounds pro-Syrian during a Venezuelan statement, you should be worried. Okay, so let's see what the Venezuelans have to say. Damos la bienvenida a la delegación. Okay, so it's this. We like to welcome the delegation of Syria. Sometimes say we wish a warm welcome to the delegation. Again, when I mix it up, just again to change things a bit. Cordial greetings to the delegation from Syria. So play about with it again. It helps expand your vocabulary. That's something you can do under these circumstances. Anyway, we wish a warm welcome to the delegation of Syria. And we're grateful we thank them for the presentation of their national report, which reflects their efforts to guarantee the human rights of the population, despite the impact of war, interference, injerencia. That's a very important concept certainly for the Venezuelans. Again, it's all about interference in the internal affairs of other states. Terrorism, so this is another favourite subject of theirs. Las medidas coercitivas impuestas, so unilateral coercive measures. Now, okay, they don't actually use the word unilateral here. Actually, I put UCMs, unilateral coercive measures. I think you could probably get away with saying it if you're in a hurry. So, okay, the coercive measures, because this is something they themselves complain about that the West does to them all the time. They tend to be the biggest victim of these unilateral coercive measures, the Cubans, against the country by the Western powers. We recommend, 1, continue promoting and protecting. So sometimes you'll hear in Spanish defensa, instead of protección, but generally, even if you're defensa, you can sort of guarantee it's going to be probably protect. Okay, so continue to protect and promote their cultural heritage. Okay, su patrimonio. It's an important word to know. It's heritage. There's no real alternative to that. You want heritage. 2. Launch a comprehensive national plan. Okay, integral. So when you hear integral, again, comprehensive tends to be the safest word to go with. To trace and restaurar, maybe I should put the word here, recover, okay, antigüedades saqueadas, okay, looted antiquities. So in this really in this case, it really applies to maybe what's going on in Palmyra, right? You all know the sort of ancient city of Palmyra in Syria, which got all the sort of antiquities there and all the artifacts dating back, I don't know, thousands, millennia, that got looted when ISIS took over that city in the midst, whenever that was, 7 or 8 years ago. So this is something they talk about at the UN in various contexts. I know in Kuwait as well, that was mentioned, like during the Iraqi invasion of Kuwait back in '91, recovering looted, I guess you could say just for saqueada, stolen antiquities. But it's a concept that's useful to be familiar with, being to trace and recover stolen or looted antiquities. And then page 2, continue to develop initiatives for social protection to minimizar el impacto negativo. There's a couple of things you could do here to minimize, whenever it's an impact, maybe to contain the negative impact, to minimize the negative impact. And for negativo, if you don't always want to be saying negative, a good alternative to that is adverse, to minimize the adverse impact of, here we go, they mentioned here unilaterales, the UCMs, for the well-being of the population. 4, continued for ampliando la cobertura, expanding coverage, extending coverage of assistance programs for families and for and sectors in situations of vulnerability, with emphasis on children, ancianos, I'd say here the elderly probably, and important persons with disabilities, okay? You can get away with saying disabled persons. Again, this is something I talk about all the time, but the sort of standard expression for disabled people is persons with disabilities. 5, redouble efforts. I'll just tend to go with when I hear redoblar, I'll tend to go with a cogne. I'll tend to just say redouble efforts and plans for the empowerment of women. Okay, that's an important concept. Empoderamiento de la mujer, empowerment of women, with emphasis on rural women. And again, we wish Syria every success during their review. Thank you. Okay, so that's the Venezuelans. So very much supportive of what the Syrians have been doing. Okay, so now we move on to the Russians, who are, of course, the biggest champions of the Syrians internationally speaking. They're very much their sort of main sponsors, if you like. And so it's very important to know what the Russian position is with regards to the current situation in Syria. So as I did this meeting, and I've actually left, there's some... As I said, we got the text in advance, so I was able to prepare it. So you can actually see, I'll point out some of the little notes that I made to make my own life easier as I was preparing it. Anyway, let's just start with this. Okay, so President We welcome, what do we welcome? The учреждение, the establishment or the creation in Syria of a national committee для контроля и координации. So whenever I hear in Russian control, or for that matter in French, I tend to sort of revert to the safest option tends to be to do with oversight or to oversee. Okay, so this is a national committee to oversee and coordinate efforts по повышению осведомленности, to raise awareness is the thing that would probably most naturally come to me in the moment. To raise awareness on normach, on the norms, the often norms of international law. For normach, another alternative is standards. I sort of use them pretty much interchangeably. Of international law и приведению национального законодательства в соответствии с ними. So for when you приведение, like законодательство, legislation, with something else, with like international law, I tend to go with, to harmonize or to bring into line, okay, to harmonize national legislation with it. But another expression they use a lot at that level is transposition. So basically transposition means the same thing. It takes the wording from international documents and it basically moves them, and it copy pastes them into national legislation. So transposition, it's sort of a fancy way of saying copy paste, really. So raise awareness about the norms of international humanitarian law, and I guess you'd say, and their transposition into national legislation. So it's just an alternative way of just talking about harmonizing. Okay. Положительно оцениваем, you only need one word here. We welcome, we commend, we applaud, another one. The readiness or the willingness of Damascus to cooperate with the international mechanisms. Then with this paragraph, don't be put off by the fact that it starts immediately with this instrumental. Okay, препятствиями. If you haven't got the text, you need to really go with it. You need to turn it into the subject of the sentence, and you say obstacles on the path towards normalizing the situation in the country. Остаются. So you need to just, you need to make it flow. So say something like obstacles still include, obstacles are still, obstacles continue to be, and then you say whatever, the illegal presence of foreign military contingents, okay? So that's especially for beginners, people who are sort of new to in their careers. You're going to find it a lot easier. I talk about this a lot in my episodes on Russian prying apart Russian butt clenchers. Okay, I'll put the card so you can go and watch that episode. Okay, so it's going to make my life a lot easier if you don't have the text. If you turn these instrumentals into nominatives and make them the subject of the sentence. So obstacles on the way to normalizing the situation in the country continue to be the illegal presence of foreign military contingents, and also, now look at that, I do the number sequence, okay, because I had the text in front of me. So I give it the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And also unilateral Western sanctions that are contrary to international law. That are counter to contrary to international law. Now the question is, what if I didn't have the text, okay? What if I didn't have that chance to prepare? And I just said, а также противоречащие международному праву односторонние западные санкции. I would probably say something like, and what runs counter to international law, namely unilateral Western sanctions. Sounds a bit clunky, but it gets the meaning across when you have, again, these big compound Russian adjective noun constructions. A gerund, is that what they're called? The word what will often help you out. So what runs counter to international law, namely unilateral Western sanctions. Now here's an important expression, okay. Неподконтрольных правительству районах, okay. So you have, on the one hand, you have government-controlled territory. That's always easy enough to do. Now, what do you call that territory that's not controlled by the government? What I usually say is in regions outside government control or in non-government controlled territory. Okay, find a sort of phrase that you're comfortable with. Okay, so I would say one of those two. Either say in territories outside government controlled or in non-government controlled territories, где сохраняют присутствие группировки, where there is still the presence of terror groups. Okay, фиксируется, that's an important word to have an immediate solution for. I usually go with to document. We've documented numerous грубые нарушения, gross violations of fundamental human rights and standards of IHL. Okay, we've documented, we've registered is maybe another good synonym. Again, here I've given you again these big sort of compound gerundives. Okay. Furthermore, so let's see how I've done it. Look, you can see the 1, 2, 3, 4. In territories liberated by the Syrian authorities. Okay, in territories liberated by the Syrian authorities, and then here I've got a 1, 2, 3. Major efforts have been invested in resolving the pressing humanitarian problems. That's how you do it with the benefit of the text. What about without the text? If you didn't have the text, you'd probably go in, also with, moreover, in liberated territories, and you probably have to repeat, liberated by the Syrian authorities, прилагаются значительные усилия. You could just say there have been major efforts to resolving the pressing humanitarian problems. Again, you've got to think on your feet a bit. You don't really, this прилагаются, it's a bit redundant. You don't have to render that. You can just say there have been significant efforts, and there have been meaningful efforts. That's a good synonym, by the way, for значительный, which I often tend to forget. Okay, meaningful. I tend to have significant, major, but meaningful efforts towards resolving pressing or острых гуманитарных проблем, burning humanitarian problems. We recommend continue efforts to combat human trafficking and provide victims with necessary assistance, and to continue to bolster cooperation, to strengthen cooperation, to forge cooperation with the relevant humanitarian organizations in order to provide assistance to VPL, very well-known acronym, this one. Not VPL, it's not VPL, it's to IDPs. I thank you. Okay, and then finally, just for a bit of fun, we have also got the Iraq statement. So here's the Iraq statement. So the Iraqis, I think they seem to play it quite cool in terms of the situation in Syria. I think they try and be more or less neutral. Obviously, there's a big American presence still there, but I don't think they want to get completely on the wrong side of the Syrians as well. So they're sort of keeping their cards quite close to their chest in their statements. So let's see what I would say here. So here we go. So I must admit, my friend Mohammed Asi, who we did, of course, the world famous first ever Interpretation Station Sunday at 6 workshop with last Sunday. He gave me a bit of help with this text and there's a couple of weird expressions that are used. So here's how we do it. So President. The delegation of Iraq welcomes the head and members of the delegation of the Syrian Arab Republic. So, I think I'd probably give them, the Syrians, the full name the first time around, perhaps the Syrian Arab Republic, and then I would go and call them Syria after that. A shakika, so whenever I would probably say like the brotherly, or I like the kindred. So whenever, at least when I'm interpreting sort of African countries and they refer to each other, their neighbours, as fraternel, I tend to say kindred. Okay, that's because it covers both brotherly and sisterly. It means they're of the same kin, they're kinfolk. Okay, so the kindred Syrian Arab Republic. And we appreciate their efforts in preparing and introducing their third report. So this is actually their third appearance before the UPR. Iraq welcomes the efforts by Syria, brotherly Syria, to implement the recommendations previously accepted. Okay, so from the previous cycles. Again, this is sort of standard formulation that delegations will say to each other, where we welcome your efforts to implement the recommendations accepted during the previous cycle. You don't again have to be word for word here, so long as you just get that notion across. So in spite of the challenges they face, Iraq, maybe put a full stop here, okay, start a new sentence. Iraq appreciates Syria's interests in the participation of women في مشروع المصالحة الوطنية. So I know that this word means really project, مشروع, but in English it sounds a bit wooden, saying appreciates the participation of women in national reconciliation projects. Doesn't sound right in English. Okay, so I spoke to Mohammed, and then we sort of thought the best thing to say might be in the national reconciliation process instead of projects, or maybe in national reconciliation efforts or endeavors. So you don't always want to go with the exact analogous word in English. So, yeah, the national reconciliation project sounds odd in English. Due to the positive role of women in paving the way for, or laying the foundations for protection and prevention, empowerment and participation. So Mohammed tells me, I struggled a bit when I first came across this section here, especially this bit في تحقيق ركائز الحماية. And so so Mohammed actually said that it sounds a bit odd even in Arabic. And so it's important, again, when you have something like this sounds a bit odd, you want to try and not to make it sound odd in English. You want to say something that sounds, that sort of rolls off the tongue. So he actually said in laying the foundations for the promotion, for the protection and prevention, setting the stage, making possible, something like that, okay? So I know literally it is in realizing the focuses, right? That's what it would be word for word. But okay, as interpreters, you sometimes have to, again, think on your feet and make sure that what you're coming out with sounds like good English. Otherwise, you're going to end up confusing the listener, okay? Now, in a spirit of constructive dialogue, again, so I think we had something similar, was it in the French expression, in the Ecuador, okay, they always say this, as they're about to make the recommendations, they always say, in a spirit of constructive dialogue, Iraq, I don't think you need to always say that, wafd, you don't need to say the delegation, I mean, it's sort of implicit, okay, Iraq would like to make the following recommendations, okay. Number one, allocate the necessary financial resources for implementation of the national strategy for التمكين الاجتماعي, so social empowerment, societal empowerment. Again, asked Mohammed about this, and he said it sounded a bit, the whole idea of what's social empowerment, and I don't know, what is that? Anyway, sounds okay. You say social empowerment, societal empowerment, whatever. 2, continue efforts towards the return of refugees and IDPs, of Syrian refugees and IDPs to their homes. Okay, again, I asked him here, manatikihim, because if you're going to go again with a literal translation, it's going to be to their areas, I guess, to their regions. But in English, we talk about the refugees and IDPs returning home, simply. That's what sounds most natural. So I would, that was my thought. It's what Mohammed also agreed with me. So I'd be sort of, keep that in mind, talking about refugees and IDPs returning home. In conclusion, the Iraqi delegation wishes the Syrian delegation, or the kindred Syrian delegation, success in this review. We wish them all the best. We wish them success. We wish them a successful review. Again, these sort of things you can play with the bit at the end when the one delegation wishes all the best to another delegation. I thank you. Okay, so there we have it. There's the Syrian medley. So I hope you've enjoyed that episode. Just a good reminder. It's still a very important subject, obviously, the situation in Syria. It's always good to remind ourselves what the stakes are, what are the big issues. Remember the Commission of Inquiry. And by the way, the Commission of Inquiry, so remember, because I hadn't done a meeting on Syria in ages before this one. And when I first heard the reference to, I think it was in French, with the enquête, I first went with a fact-finding mission. There's a bit of in some countries you have fact-finding missions, in some countries you have commissions of inquiry. So in Syria it's a commission of inquiry. The fact-finding mission is for Libya, for example. That's where there's a fact-finding mission. So just remember to keep those two apart. Okay, so yes, I'm going to put the links to all these texts and try and find the audio so you can practice them yourselves. I'll put them as usual in the description box. Like, share, subscribe. Keep an eye out for any more announcements if I'm doing more workshops. Hopefully there might be one next week. There might be one next weekend, maybe for French or Spanish. We'll see. Follow me on the LinkedIn. That's where I make all the announcements. And don't forget the website, theinterpretationstation.org. And with that, all that remains to be said is that episode 112 of the Interpretation Station stands adjourned.